Tri-Paste Pod presents
an awkward audio adaptation of Mynde by Kaleb Nelson. Chapter 1: The Monstrous.
A distant relative approached me early one Friday morning, asking if I had heard my father had recently passed. I responded, half-handedly, while deep inside I felt something a little less indifferent. I hadn't heard from my father in 2 decades, hadn't seen him in 3. What effect could this possibly have on me, or the likes of my mundane life as a manager at the copy print center? Jerry, my father's sister's son through marriage, carried on.
I think you had better go see the lawyer. My mother says he left some antiquities in his will, possibly more.
Still, I couldn't bring myself to care all too freely. My father had left my mother and I alone when I was hardly old enough to beg him to stay. My mother, who had died while I was in high school, never attempted to reconnect me with him, and thus, I hadn't spent much of my life pining over his absence. The time I had spent was successfully blocked out through the years of rigorous therapy and alcohol consumption. Well, has he left me something? Jerry had a strange expression. Anxiety, jealousy, I couldn't tell.
Why don't you go have a talk with the lawyer? I really wouldn't want to put my foot in my mouth.
He handed me a card. On it read Dwight Jorgensen, in slightly bubbled up lettering, attorney at law specializing in wills, trusts, and inheritance. And below that, an address. Jerry continued on his way with a smile and a nod of his cap. Jorgensen's office wasn't far from my home, and I decided I would stop by after work. What's the harm, I thought. I arrived just as they seemed to be closing up. I introduced myself to the secretary as she's putting on her coat. I'm Samuel Watts. I'm sorry I'm here so late, but I'm here to see Mr. Jorgensen. She paused for a moment.
Please have a seat over there.
I did as I was told, and I sat in the center of the faded fake leather sofa on the other end of the room. I watched as the secretary picked up the phone.
Sir, we have Mr. Watts here to see you.
I had a hard time discerning the mood of the receptionist. Was she frustrated that I had made her late to leave work, or was she focused on her work? The wallpaper behind her head was peeling, or was it part of the design? I didn't have too long to investigate before she spoke.
Mr. Jorgensen will see you now.
I nodded my thanks as I walked through the door.
I've been very excited to meet you, Mr. Watts.
Please, call me Sam. I just spoke to Jerry this morning. I found out about my father. Honestly, I was more than a little creeped out by his greeting. What do you mean, excited?
Charmed, I mean. Please, have a seat. Well, I have to tell you, Sam, your day is about to get a whole lot more interesting. How much do you know of your father's recent activities?
Next to nothing, really. It's been 20 years. Last I heard from him, he was living in 400 miles north in the country, and he called me once asking how my mother was. I can barely recall the conversation anymore.
Well, as you know, it seems he's passed on. I'm very sorry for your loss. Heart failure, they are saying? I have his last will and testament here, and it would seem the man has left you a sizable inheritance. Nearly $12 million in assets, including an 1,100-acre estate.
I felt a pit in my stomach. I had no conceivable idea my father had this kind of fortune. Why would my father even leave me anything? This all weighed heavy on my mind, but thinking of my father dredged up all kinds of emotions that I thought I'd work my way past. Rage, longing, and despair, but mostly I felt empty. With both my parents now dead, I was truly alone. It took me several minutes to respond.
Mr. Watts?
Call me Sam. This must be some kind of mistake. My father was broke when he left my mother. He never left child support, and he hasn't even mentioned leaving me a single dime in my name.
Well, I don't know what to tell you, Sam. This paper certainly says otherwise. There is one problem. The will isn't complete. It was sent here via fax from the Mynde estate, but see for yourself.
On the final page of the document, at the bottom, was the text, page 9 of 11.
Without the remainder of the document, we can't actually proceed with the distribution of property. Someone will need to retrieve the documents from the manor, assuming they are there to be retrieved. We can send a courier, but they wouldn't arrive till Monday. Otherwise, I suppose you could go yourself.
His smile was slightly unsettling, Or perhaps I just felt unsettled. Either way, I thanked the man and told him I'd let him know what I decided. That night, when I got home to my lonely, crummy apartment, filled with anxiety and disbelief, I felt trapped within myself, with no one to tell. I was overcome by an urge to lie down and calm my nerves. $12 million? Could this be for real? I decided that I'd take the train up to the country in the morning and find out for myself. I decided that I'd rather know it was too good to be true as soon as possible. When I awoke, I called Jorgensen's office and told him that I'd be visiting the estate this weekend. It was around 11 when I bought the ticket from the teller and got on the earliest train ride to the estate in the country. I boarded the train as soon as it arrived and made my way down the aisle as it chugged back up to speed. I was seated across from a woman, who at first I couldn't tell if I was attracted to, as she was staring through her reflection out the window to the cold autumn morning. She wore a blue blouse and long dark blue skirt that shook slightly with the rocking of the train. I picked up where I had left off in the book and took the odd glance at her over the pages. After a while, she looked at me, and I decided I was most assuredly attracted to her.
I love that book. Can I ask how far you've gotten?
Oh, I do as well. It's one of my favorites. It's about to get really interesting.
Where are you going?
I didn't particularly like it when I was interrupted by strangers while reading, but I decided I'd allow it, being that she seemed genuinely friendly. All the way up to Hereford?
No way! I'll be staying in Hereford tonight before I head on to Washington in the morning. What brings you out to the country?
My father passed away. He lived up on Mynde estate, and I was going to assist with making arrangements.
I'm sorry. So sorry to hear that.
She was noticeably more pale. It's really all right. We've been a bit estranged since I was a child.
Still, what awful news. I wish something a bit more positive had brought you out of the city. You certainly do seem to be handling it well.
I watched her mouth, corner to corner, as her words flowed out with various emotions and intricacies of speech. I talked with her for nearly the entire length of the train ride, a little over 4 hours. As the train slowed, signaling we had arrived, it was nearly sunset.
You know, you'll never make it to the estate before dark. Why don't you come by my hotel? Got a double, but maybe we don't need it.
Clearly, she was offering to sleep with me. I weighed my options for all about 2 seconds, maybe 3 before agreeing. You know, that's quite an offer. I might just take you up on it. After a few drinks in the simple but satisfactory hotel room, she leaned in to kiss me. We didn't do much sleeping until the sun was just barely visible on the horizon, at which point I slept more soundly than I had ever slept in my life. My dreams were gnarled and twisted that night, though. She was gone when I awoke. I saw only a painting of an empty bowl upon a reflective surface. Or I suppose it could have been an hourglass? I didn't ponder it for very long, because I realized it was getting late. It was afternoon already. No wonder she was gone. After a quick shower and a shave, I stepped outside the hotel room, and the sun was blinding. I put a quarter in the nearby payphone to call a cab, for which the number was printed on the back cover of the attached phone book.
Destination, please.
Watts residence at the Mynde estate?
We don't go up that road. I'm sorry.
Wait, why not?
The road isn't safe, sir. No one ever makes it back. Trouble with the road.
What do you mean no one ever makes it back? What trouble? Hello, ma'am? Ma'am, hello? So I started walking. It was only every 10 or 15 minutes that I'd see a car pass, usually in the opposite direction. But one pickup truck came bouncing along behind me, and I know the driver saw my thumb, but almost visibly hesitated before stopping to let me in. Thank you so much. I must have another 15 miles ahead of me, and any little bit you could help me with would be so much appreciated.
You headed up there to that mine place? We'll hop in, I can take you about halfway.
I decided to get into the back of the truck as it seemed the most reasonable way to keep both of us from feeling uncomfortable. Through the driver's side mirror, I could see the driver had only one eye, or was he squinting? I couldn't quite tell. I tried not to stare and instead looked at the scenery. We'd be coming up on my father's land soon to be my land, and it was beautiful. It seemed almost surreal, like something out of a dream. I didn't have much time to admire it, though, as I heard a change in the tinny sounds coming from the radio. I couldn't make out what the alert was, but something had the driver worried. He pulled over almost immediately and began shouting inside the cab.
Oh, you have to go. Get out. Go.
But sir, why? How much further, please?
You gotta go. Just go.
He drove off without answering my question. I despised that. I hoisted my small pack over my shoulder and started walking. I calculated that it couldn't be more than 7 more miles and maybe 3 hours until sundown. As tired as my feet became, I still couldn't help but admire my surroundings. My father certainly had chose a wondrous place to call home, even if it was without his family. The sun had just gone down past the tree horizon. The entire setting had become quite dim and tinged with orange. I stopped when I heard something. Wind, maybe? No, not wind. Great bristling creatures circling me. There were 2, maybe 3. I lost count as they closed in and weaved through the trees towards me. What is that? A wolf? No earthly creatures. No earthly creature stands on its hind legs like that, with a great heaving back and shoulder muscles. And then, what is that? Laughter? No, God, please, no. Spare me. Even in a moment such as this, I couldn't help but feel the guilt and cowardice of an atheist begging for mercy from a God he didn't even remotely believe in. The swirling black fear crept into my vision, and I was all but unconscious. But still, I ran, and they closed in. The last thing I felt was a harsh tug and a dragging by the collar of my shirt, and above my face a flare of light distant in the darkness, clouding my vision.
You're mine now, boy. You're not going anywhere.
I awoke on a simple cot in what appeared to be a damp prison cell. The walls around me were wood, except for the cold metal bars toward my feet. I could hear muffled muttering coming from just beyond the wall to the room.
There, that's a tasty treatment for the boy. Have another, boy. This one's for me. Me, it's mine. Now wait your turn, boy. You'll get your chance.
I felt an intense, dull, nagging pain of fear coursing through my body. I knew I couldn't stay. I knew this would be my undoing. I looked around in my tiny prison. I saw bones in the corner of the room and made my way towards them, crawling silently along the ground. One of the bones was splintered in 2, and I picked up the sharper end just in case. The noise from the next room was so horrible. I had to see what was happening. I couldn't stay here another minute. I just couldn't. I became desperate. I shook and I kicked, and to my surprise, the cage door sprung open.
No, you can't go in there.
Blood pumped in my ears, and I didn't stay to listen to what he had to say. This time I knew he was following me before it was upon me. I heard a raucous barking and horrid laughter. It snapped at me, back on my shirt. I felt it before I had a chance to look back, and still it laughed and snarled. Then it was on me. I felt it, its gnarled paws and claws upon me and my back, tearing into my shirt and flesh. And then I knew I was fighting for my life. I was rounded upon the ground and saw its face bearing down on mine. Its muzzle was too flat and wide to be a wolf or any species of dog I've ever seen. Its eyes, they almost seemed human, and as it snapped at me, it dove in with all of its claws. Fur ripped off into my hand, revealing pink skin, not unlike my own. I reached for the weapon that had flown from my hands, grabbing it, burying it deep within the creature's throat. It whimpered and crumpled upon me, blood gushing from its wound as its life emptied from its very human eyes. But how? How could this beast have flesh in the eyes of a man? I crawled out from underneath it. I ran like I'd never run before in my life. I knew if I'd stopped, it, whatever it was, would find me. They would find me, the whole pack of them. I knew God was finally on my side when I stumbled across the path I'd been on hours ago. Had it been hours? Along the path I ran until my legs gave out beneath me. I slid probably a full meter across the ground and heaved giant lungs full of dust. I looked up. I rubbed the dust from my eyes, and I saw a gate in the middle of the path. On it, a gold placard that read, Mynde Estate. Just a few more meters, and I would be okay. I cannot rest. Not now. I climbed back to my feet and stepped through the archway.
You've just been embarking on a journey through the mind of Samuel Watts. Thank you for listening to Mynde Estate. Please like us on Facebook and Twitter at Mynde Estate. be sure to tune in for Chapter 2, The Grizzly.
Try Paste Pod presents
An awkward audio adaptation of Mind Estate by Kaleb Nelson. Chapter 2, The Grizzly.
The ornate knocker from the large double doors of the building fell upon itself and echoed through the house time and time again with no response. I tried turning the handle. It swung open with a squeal. My eyes were met with darkness, not empty, filled with darkness. My eyes adjusted, but I pulled out my lighter anyway. Flicking it on, I saw some of the details of the entrance room. The furniture was old, but the paint and the floorboards all seemed recently renovated. I didn't see a speck of dust on anything, but I heard nothing. The silence was dense, but not impermeable. Where were those voices coming from? I never expected anyone would be here, and to be honest, I couldn't have felt more relieved at the prospect of human companionship right now. It seems like they were coming from below me, from a staircase off to my left. I started down them. The stairs spiraled downward for what seemed like an eternity, as the voices became clearer, and then, before I reached the bottom, they stopped. The smell down here was putrid, fermentation and decay among other things. I saw two doors, one where I thought the voices had come from. I turned the handle and entered.
You can't have returned so soon.
What do you mean? Who are you? I could only see the man's back, and around him rows and rows of wooden casks. His head of dark hair had a bald spot on the top. He seemed to be inspecting one before I'd arrived. He turned around when I spoke.
It is you. What a pleasant surprise. Please do come in. We have been expecting you. I am so excited to meet you.
The man was pretty unremarkable, except that his skin seemed strangely taut for a man of his age. Where there should have been wrinkles, there was only sallow and papery skin from his balding head to his thin lips and almost non-existent chin. Excited? Why does everyone keep saying that? What's going on? Who are you?
Please, I must ask that you keep your voice down, friend. I was close to your father. You have the same exact face as him, you know? Same expressive face. Same troubled face. Why are you so anxious? Did his death affect you so?
No, I really had quite the night. There are things out there in the night, just dreadful things. Do you know?
There are dreadful things out there in the day, too. I'm glad you made it here in one piece. Please, let's have a chat. Have a seat. Have a drink with me.
He bared a smile that sent a shiver through to my core. He gestured to the two chairs and a small table before him. There were two full glasses already sitting there. I stared at him. I did not feel like sitting, but his offering seemed strangely comforting, so I sat. Who are you? Why are you acting so familiar with me? What are you even doing here? This is my father's place, is it not?
Well, your father never took issue with us being here. Not until recently, that is. But he hasn't been of his right mind as of late. Still, he needed us.
Us? Who is us? He picked up the two glasses that had already been filled. Had he been waiting for someone? Had he been waiting for me? He handed one to me. It contained a crimson-red liquid that seemed syrupy, almost thick in the low lighting. I didn't want to take the glass, but the man's insistence was almost intoxicating, his congeniality almost hypnotic. The glass felt surprisingly warm in my hand compared to the frigid cold of the room.
What do you even know about this place? You don't seem very well informed at all, my boy. What even brought you here?
His tight-lipped smile continued to unnerve me, but his eyes held me transfixed upon our conversation. But I noticed myself without a lot more to say. I just decided to ask one question. So, what am I doing here?
We have a tradition among my people that when we share a drink together, we discover our natural bonds. We become one people.
He completely ignored my question. Well, that sounds friendly and all, but what is this drink? I swirled it and it coated the walls of the glass.
It's my own special blend. Oh, so sweet. I tapped it myself. Do you know the nature of your father's work here?
No, I don't. That's part of the reason I'm here. He hasn't seen me in almost 30 years. How did he even achieve this fortune? Why would he leave me this place in his will? I'm here to find the last pages. This was not the laugh of a normal man, but something else entirely. It curdled the drink in my glass, and it made me cringe.
You, my friend, have a lot to learn about your family. But I will say this. The will itself remains a mystery. We don't know why your father wrote this will. All we know is that you're here now, and we will find out together.
Why do you keep saying we? You're the only person I've seen other than the man on the grounds, the wolf man. I swallowed hard and looked away. I wondered if we were even safe from those things in here.
You met Patrick.
No, you can't go in there.
He's such a loyal companion and groundskeeper. He watches over the grounds of that pack of mongrels. I've never been one for their kind of savagery. I prefer the finer things in life.
I still don't even know your name.
How rude of me. My name is Sebastian. I've been watching over the place this week in lieu of your father's absence and the absence of his love.
His love?
Oh, he never told you then. He made a new family here with the lady of the house and her 2 sons.
I don't believe you. He left me and my mother because he was so maligned towards having a family. There's no way he would adopt another. You're lying to me.
Why are you getting so reactive, my dear boy? You mustn't let your emotions get the better of you. Now is the time to be strong. You should be happy. After your mother died, I should think that you'd be thrilled to learn you have a new family here, with us.
How did you know my mother died? What did you bring me here for? I want answers. I'm looking for the missing pages of his will. I felt an overwhelming anger towards this man and his way of speaking. His words were riddled with games, and he had yet to even show a bit of empathy toward me and my plight.
Young sir, you have no idea what you've stumbled into. I'm going to have to ask you to remain calm. You've had such a long couple of days.
He stood moving around my chair to stand behind me. He placed his hand on my shoulders. I wasn't particularly comfortable with this, but I couldn't bring myself to tell him to stop. I felt his breath in my ears as he lowered his head towards me. His grip tightened on my shoulders, keeping me from standing. He began to massage my neck. What are you doing? Feeling violated, I made to stand, but his hands pushed me down firmly. They felt skeletal, but unnaturally strong.
Please don't fuss. Try to remain calm.
I glanced at the mirror that faced us. His eyes seemed white, had they rolled in the back of his head. He looked up and smiled at me, that terrible toothy grin. His incisors elongated and razor sharp. He deepened his massage, lowering his head as he did, but I could feel the moisture from his mouth on my neck. He was muttering something in a language I didn't understand. Distant though the mirror was, I saw his eyes go black now, and then his reflection was gone. At this point, I knew the man missing from reflection was no man at all. I felt 2 sharp pains in my neck in quick succession. What are you doing? Had I said it? Or just thought it. The room swirled black, and all I felt was the vacuum of pain toward my head and neck. But I fought it. The room came swirling back, and I shouted once more, "What are you doing?" I broke free of his grasp and struck him across the face. A small drop of black blood dripped from his wound, before it seemed to heal itself and appear non-existent.
Stop shouting, you fool. You'll disturb them.
His whisper was violent. I looked around. Disturb who? What are you people? Suddenly the cast lining the room began to burst open, and the contents began to spill out on the floor, seemingly in slow motion. It was blood. I knew it instantly. It flowed, thick and velvety around me. More and more began to burst. In a matter of moments, I was standing ankle deep in the horrible liquid. Immediately, the man's demeanor changed. He was irate as he lunged for my neck. His hands gripped me, closing my windpipe. I shoved him, and his body felt frail to my hands. Still, he pushed towards me. He tightened his grip on my neck.
Oh, you heathen, you wretch. How dare you come in here and try to destroy my life's work? You seem to insist, so I will send you to the hell you plainly crave. Harold!
The next few moments were merely flashes as a burly, bald, monstrous man of uncanny size and strength stormed through the open door. He barreled toward me and slammed his shoulder into me, into the wall. I felt a rib crack, and I crumpled to the floor. As I opened my eyes, I saw that I was hanging from the ceiling, staring at the floor. I was strapped upside down to some surface tilted at an angle so that my feet were elevated, and all I could feel was the blood rushing to my head. Strangely, the straps were loose, and I was flat upon the table. Gravity was not itself here. I tried to fathom how this was possible as I noticed my surroundings. The flesh and bone dotted the floor below me. I saw hanging, lifeless figures all around. I felt sick. I couldn't breathe. Blood continued to fill my head. I looked to my right, and I was not alone. On the other surface, upside down from the ceiling, was the vampire, Sebastian's eyes piercing into me as we hung there. But there was no straps on him. He got up with a minor struggle, favoring the wound in his side. He stood with feet upon the ceiling, with no concern of the gravity that should have sent him to the floor 20 feet below. He clung to the ceiling, walked about it with demonic ease. Were his feet clawed into the ceiling itself? What are you gonna do to me? I couldn't hide the panic in my voice.
Oh, sleep, my son. We can settle this in the morning.
He touched my forehead, and his hands felt icy upon my head, where the blood had accumulated. Then he left my view. You can't just leave me here. You can't leave me here. Let me go. Please, let me go. The pain was intense, and once again, I blacked out. I don't know how much time had passed between that moment and the next, but now the room was right side up. I saw the same bodies hanging from the ceiling, but now the surface I lie upon was the floor, and the straps were loose enough for me to wriggle free from. It seemed I was in a butchery, a room filled with dismembered body parts from various creatures. They all looked the same without skin or hides or hair, but I know that I saw multiple human heads. I saw the twisted half-man seated there. I quietly wriggled free from the bindings on the table. I stood. In the center of the room, I stood. I felt so exposed as I scanned the room for something I could use as a weapon. I moved forward silently. There was a mop bucket in the corner. As I approached Sebastian, he spoke softly. Where I had expected he'd be paralyzed with fear, he seemed to almost bask in it.
So you've come to kill me, then?
He didn't even turn around, and he was still whispering. I hated it. It felt so unnatural.
Wait, what if I told you where the will is that you're looking for? Would that be an interest to you?
I saw him turn white when I shoved the stake through his heart. He made a hissing sound from his mouth as he took 2 steps back with a twisted face of rage and pain.
That will be lost to you. It will never come to be. This will never be your domain.
I regained my bearings. My blood was pumping like a hammer on an anvil. What had I done? This man was obviously insane and unnatural, but did I just kill him? I looked down at my hands. Blood was black and foul, and it seemed to almost irritate my skin. Now burning, it became unbearable as it sizzled like acid. I searched the room for something to wash my hands and returned to the mop bucket, feeling immediate relief. when just then I heard a noise behind me, the entrance to this butchery. I looked toward the entrance of the room. And there, the psycho stood, monstrous in the center of the doorway. He moved forward silently now, with nothing but a bloodied rubber apron and jeans on. This man would kill me immediately, I knew. The pupils of his eyes were ready to eviscerate me and tear my carcass into several pieces. As he approached me, he reached for the meat cleaver on the table, never breaking eye contact with me. I ran further into the meat cutting room, and he set chase to me. I thought I was making care not to slip on the viscera spewed across the ground, but I slipped, my chin hit the ground, and I bit my tongue. I knew he would be upon me in moments, so I squirmed across the blood-smeared floor. I felt his hands close upon my ankles, and I almost heard the wind of the cleaver carving through the air. A scream escaped my throat involuntarily as I narrowly avoided losing the lower half of my leg. I scrambled upon all fours as he wrenched the blade from the splintered floor. I hobbled to the freezer door in the corner. A blast of cold air reached my face as I pulled open the door and squeezing through, pulling the door shut behind me, just as his face reached a small square window, stricken with enraged lunacy. He pounded on the door. I searched for an alternate exit. Something, anything. An overwhelming sense of doom plummeted from my heart to the bottom of my gut as I realized there was no exit. I looked instead for a place to hide amid the hanging sides of meat. Behind a rack filled with hindquarters of some livestock, I crouched, barely able to see the rest of the freezer through the severed pieces of flesh. I felt sick to my stomach before the door even opened, and I knew he had joined me in the freezer. All I could hear was his breath heavy on the cold wind of the refrigerator hum. He made it to the rack I hid behind. I could see his breath now filtering through the rack behind me, and then his breath was gone. I peeked through the racks. I saw the behemoth naked back of the butcher, and I crept softly behind him. I knew I had one chance to end his life before he could turn around and end my own. I rounded up, and it plunged a 6-inch blade into the back of his neck, nearly missing his spinal column. As I suspected, he turned and quickly tried to stifle the life from my body with his massive arms. He grabbed me. He threw me against the wall next to him. I couldn't breathe. And winding up the blade, he still held in his arm, blood draining from above his shoulder. He was on his knees when I tried to grab the knife from his neck and gave it its final resting home in his chest. Blood poured out of him, and while this man was clearly had been human, he was deranged. He looked at me, not with fear or anguish, but simple blind anger and hatred. Perhaps even desperation. A longing to kill? I would never know. I left the freezer door and closed it behind me, leaning upon it. As I rubbed my tired eyes, I opened them to no relief. The fingers upon the hooks began to extract the sharp metal from their bodies. 2 men, 2 women, murdered and contorted by the grisly butcher, naked and scarred, fell upon the ground, set their dull sights upon me.
You've just been embarking on a journey through the mind of Samuel Watts. Thank you for listening to Mind Estate. Please like us on Facebook and Twitter at Mind Estate. Be sure to tune in for Chapter 3, The Unsettled.
Tri-Paced Pod presents
An awkward audio adaptation of Mind Estate by Kaleb Nelson. Chapter 3, The Unsettled.
Daddy, where are you going?
Mother just stood there. Why is she just standing there?
My son, I have to go now. You'll understand when you are older. Go. Be with your mother now. Enjoy your time here. Study hard in school. Do your best. I truly hope things will be different someday. I want you to know that I tried.
No, don't go. I don't want you to go. Please.
He looked back at me with a sad face. Maybe he's angry at me?
This is what's best for both of us. I promise.
Half-dozen dead hands reached out to me, stumbling and groping for me through the blood-smeared, fluorescent-lit meat-cutting room. Despite my nearly overwhelming exhaustion, I made the leave, backing my way out of the room as they picked up speed, hobbling towards me. I felt a gnarled hand grip me painfully on the shoulder. I looked around and saw the dirty fingernails attempting to claw into my flesh, and a gaping mouth of crooked teeth moving towards my face, spittle flecking out with a gasping screech. I swung an elbow at the hideous, disheveled face, striking bone against teeth. Now the other three were almost upon me. I climbed upon the table which I had just laid upon an hour before. Leaping over their heads, I landed hard on the ground. My ankle. I might have sprained it. I ran out the door, and I could hear the scraping, lumbering footsteps behind me. I made for the stairs that brought me to this hellish place, but I realized I didn't know which direction they were. I did smell the dank pool of blood from the cellar, but I didn't know which hallway it emanated from. I chose a path and took it, looking for any signs of relief. Turning corners until I reached a dead end. Would this be my own dead end? No. I reached the end of the hallway, and there was one small door. I grabbed the handle and swung it open, but to my dismay, it was merely a closet, empty but for an old sweater. I considered hiding within it, but quickly decided that would merely seal my doom. I still heard the rambling corpses following me, and I knew I only had seconds before they found me. They rounded the corner. Faster now, they'd gained momentum as they shambled towards me. I was finished. Praying once more to God, I looked up, seeing a window just barely the width of my shoulders, probably just for ventilation. It was still dark outside. Standing on the tips of my toes, I was able to open it, but now the dead were almost upon me. I jumped and scrambled, kicking my legs at their outstretched arms, knowing that if they got a hold of me, they'd pull me back in. I kicked, and I felt my shoes make contact thrice upon their heads and their collarbones, giving me the boost I needed to climb up and out the window. One crawled up immediately after me, its shoulders barely through the window. It grabbed my leg. Its horrid fingernails were a vice grip tearing through my jeans and my flesh. I yelped in pain. I slid the window down upon the neck hard. It barely flinched, and it continued clawing its way towards me, up my leg. I brought it down again and again. I winced at the crunching sound of its windpipe and the small bones of its spine. Then the smashing of its larynx and esophagus sounded wet. Her head lolled away from her body, teeth still gnashing. The moans of hungering anguish of the others trapped behind me were muffled within the basement. I sighed deep, knowing I was relatively safe for the moment. I fell back into the grass and looked up through the fog to the twilight sky and felt the moisture of the dew seep through my shirt onto my back. It was quiet, but for the odd distant croak of a toad. Standing gingerly upon the damaged ankle, I found myself in the midst of the courtyard that must have been out back of the manor. Backing away, still cautious of the ghouls behind me, I made my way towards a tremendously lavish stone fountain. Physically and mentally I was drained. The pain in my side was throbbing, and the pain in my leg was stinging. I approached and peered into the trickling pool. For some reason, perhaps I just was already on edge, my own reflection startled me. I splashed water on my face, and I took a deep breath. Then I heard a voice. Alarmed, I jerked my head around. There was no one in sight. I went to splash more water on my face, and I thought I saw not my own reflection staring back at me, but that of my father. He looked entirely insane, his face bloodied and murder in his eyes.
Wait for us. We'll take him together. I'll kill you.
I closed my eyes and rubbed them to get the image out. Opening them, I saw the reflection of one of the dead things standing just behind me, wild-eyed and murderous. It must have followed me out of the house. I reacted quickly as it lunged for my neck, and mouth agape with a terrible moan. It toppled over the edge of the fountain. I forced its face to the edge of the stone fountain with my hand. I saw the two others close behind me and started once again to panic. I stood tall and brought my boot down on the back of the dead thing's skull. Lifting my foot, I saw that it still tried to stand. I brought it down again and again. His face became bloody pulp of rotten meat, dripping onto the ground and into the fountain. I felt the mental strain mounting once again, and I noticed myself starting to shake. The other two were almost upon me as I regained my balance. Almost slipping on the newly bloodied boot, I ran. There were multiple voices now. Faint at first, they grew louder as I reached the outskirts of the courtyard, and I found myself amongst the trees. There didn't seem to be any source of the voices, not at first.
You're a monster. Try to remain calm.
What are you looking for? You'll get your chance.
Get him! Kill him!
Where are you going?
You'll never make it.
There were still two of the rambling dead following me through the trees. Back against a tree, I caught my breath once more. Think, Sam. Think. What do I do? They're dumb and slow. I knew I could use my speed and my wits to outmaneuver them. I knew which side of the tree it would come around. I crouched and waited. Moments turned to minutes, and the voices continued. I peered through the trees and saw nothing. Then I felt a hand on the back of my neck, and another quick upon the back of my skull. Its semi-close fist came down hard upon my head. It was so strong, so abnormally strong. I saw exploding stars in my eyes and almost faded to black. I fell to the ground from my crouched position. The ghoul was on me, and I barely kept its mouth away from my flesh with my left arm at its throat. My right arm fell to the side, and I found a sturdy inch-thick branch. I gripped it, I wound up, and I shoved it through the base of the thing's skull. Rolling out from underneath it, I pushed it deeper into her head. I stood quickly, and before I could think, vomited copiously. One hand on the tree next to me, I heard the footsteps of the final undead man. This was the biggest of the lot. I tried to pull the branch from the head of the previous corpse, but it was too stuck, and I broke it in half, further destroying the thing's rotting face and skull. Fight turned into flight again as I turned on a heel and sprinted into the forest, ignoring the pain and my multiple injuries. I slowed down. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw another figure moving through the trees. I turned to my left and saw nothing. A trick of the light? A shadow of a tree in the wind? I stopped to be certain. Another dark figure passed through my view on the opposite side. Who's there? I darted my head back and forth. Once again, a figure on my left. I spun around. Show yourself! A shrouded, shimmery outline of a person stepped out from my right, gliding towards me, reaching out a hand in the dark. No, stop. What do you want? But before I could move to escape or attack, another came from the left, another came from behind me, and one more far to its right. 4, 5, now 6 shadowy figures moved towards me. They had no discernible features other than being dark and non-corporeal. They closed in slowly, all of them raising one hand towards me. Leave me alone! Get away from me! I couldn't do anything. They had me surrounded. Their ghastly hands all touched me in unison. It felt like ice upon my skin. No, within my skin. They all continued to move towards me and pass into my body. And just as the last one disappeared within me, I saw the zombie once more. No! I couldn't run anymore. The race had done something to me. They broke my will. I pushed back fruitlessly and hobbled my way towards the clearing in the trees. I saw a gravestone and collapsed down next to it. The creature fell atop me. I was an animal, fighting for my life once more. I wrestled my way on top of the mindless man. I felt my fingers slip into its eyes and mouth, peeling the flesh from its dead face. With a solid grasp of the elastic skin of its face, I swung its full weight into the gravestone next to me. Cracking his skull, his lifeless body went limp. I smashed it several more times into the gravestone, bruising my knuckles, tears at the corners of my eyes. It slowly started to rain. I stood using the gravestone to haul up my weary body, but I was too weak to stay vertical. I toppled over the gravestone, 6 feet into the grave itself. Freshly dug, I found myself atop the coffin with only about an inch of dirt upon it. Something compelled me to look up at the face of the gravestone. On it read, Samuel Watts? My stomach dropped. Was that today's date? Then an inscription, Rest peacefully until eternity? I turned my gaze to the casket beneath me. I leaned over and opened the lid. It was me. It was my face, every dimple, every feature. I touched it, and it seemed to fall apart at my touch. I must be dreaming. Of course I'm dreaming. This has been a bad dream. I have to wake up. I'm dreaming. I must be. I turned onto my back, lying in my own grave. 7 figures, cloaked in black, stood around me, pointing at me. The one at the foot of my grave was wearing a red cloak. They all pointed towards me. I've never felt this level of fear. It was as if an organ had ruptured within me, and the churning acid of fear began eating through my innards. I passed out. I was standing in infinite black. My hands appeared ethereal amidst the chasm of darkness.
You are your father's son.
What do you mean? You are the woman he left my mother for.
I am, but to you, all I am is death. I cannot wait to meet you, because you see, I have been meaning to tell you something. Your father, he never loved you. He never loved your mother. He wanted you to know that. He made me promise. I tell you before I die.
Why? Please, this is all too much. Please just let me go home.
You can't go home. You will die tonight. Your death will bring me closer to your father's fortune, and it will bring you closer to the infinite abyss of pain and suffering. And you know that no salvation awaits you at the eternal slaughter. You will find an eternity of agonizing sorrow, and then you will awaken from that prison, only to continue in the endless cycle of life and death, misery and torture. You will be doomed to your own existence for eternity.
No! I awoke to the dim light of the morning, still lying within the grave. I looked down, and the remains were gone. Dizzy and parched with thirst, I stood weakly to peer out of the grave. With very little will left to carry on, I decided to see this through. What life did I have to go back to anyway? I massaged my temples and took a deep breath before hoisting myself up and out of the grave. In the light of the day, I could make out the house from the small graveyard. I made my way toward it, feeling stiff and pained. I felt heat upon my face as I walked into the house through the back entrance. I felt it upon my back as I closed the pane glass door. I found myself inside a sun parlor, with many plants here flourishing and beautiful, fauna I'd never seen before. My body and my mind were still in need of rest. I needed to sit and think, but I knew I was not safe, and I had my doubts that things would get any easier from here. Then came the smell. Burning gases or sulfur or some such stench began to emanate from somewhere. The hellish odor was overpowering. I began to feel inexplicably warm. I removed my coat and held it to my nose. I tried to prepare my mind for whatever ungodly horror this place had in store for me next. But I knew it was futile. I was gone now, drifting from the edge of reality.
You've just been embarking on a journey through the mind of Samuel Watts. Thank you for listening to Mind Estate. Please like us on Facebook and Twitter at Mind Estate. Be sure to tune in for Chapter 4, The Infernal.
Try Paste Pod presents
An awkward audio adaptation of Mind Estate by Kaleb Nelson. Chapter 4, The Infernal.
The walls of the glass room ignited with the light of fire. I watched a kaleidoscope of flames engulf the sun parlor. A foul stench percolated throughout, thick with evil and corruption. I continued to take in my surroundings. Wildflowers from all corners of the world, small fruit-bearing plants and vines. And there was also a tank of some kind, an enormous terrarium filled with reptiles near the window. I chanced a glance into the tank, but immediately I heard a chorus of booming voices approaching the same door I had just entered through. I crouched behind a couple of large potted ferns. At this point, I was getting used to the fear in my gut and in my heart. I turned that fear into instinct. This I would use to survive, to fight back. The voices multiplied as they opened the door, and I saw them begin to pour in. At first, I wasn't sure how many I saw, but I counted at least a half a dozen figures as I peered through the foliage. The sun rose higher and the room got hotter. Without the shade of dawn, my hiding place became more conspicuous. Silently, I adjusted to the shadows of the day, moving behind one fern to the next. The devils were clearly unaware of my presence thus far. I peered at them once more from my hiding place. Twisted and freakish, if they were ever human at all, they are no longer. At least 3 of them darted through the room with shrill laughter and unprecedented speed. Did they have wings? Their faces were grinning, smiles of demented joy. Their laughter made me feel ill, covered in head to toe in a thick, dark fur. Much taller and larger in stature, twin demons followed, with unnatural depth to their voices. If either was female, there was no way of knowing for certain. All I could see was dirty, reddish skin, dark, rugged clothing, and jet black hair on their faces and on their bodies.
Do you smell something? I hunger for the taste of meat.
Let's burn it to a crisp. I like it charred.
Then, in unison, they both drank from the flasks on their hips and belched a stream of fire. I couldn't believe my eyes and felt the sweat bead upon my forehead. They were followed by one more, a woman with scales amongst her dry, hardened skin. She wore a tattered dress that reached the floor. I didn't even see any legs. Did she have legs? The way she moved suggested slinking rather than walking. Like the others, she seemed delighted. But from where I stood, I saw no teeth within her smile, or perhaps only 2. Fangs, filthy and dripping with yellowed green. Venomous, no doubt. She spoke.
My babies. My pretty babies.
She wasn't speaking to the others, but instead she spoke into the terrarium. No doubt they were her reptiles. As I peered through the foliage with bated breath, she began to sing. I noticed snakes crawling up her arms as she reached down into the tank. And then, even amid her hair, snakes. No, her hair was made of snakes. It was also clear now. This hellish creature from myth I've read about in grade school. A gorgon? I averted my gaze. I knew I couldn't chance looking into her terrible eyes for fear of turning to stone. I mustn't look into her eyes. The imps and the demons left the room towards the main part of the house, but the serpentine woman remained. The raspy tune she was humming I'd never heard before. She continued to wander about the room, caring for her reptiles. Her humming stopped short. She and I both noticed my bloodied footprints upon the floor.
What's this? Some tasteless joke? Who's trying to get your eyes out of me? Aaron! Sebastian! Is that you?
I decided not to wait for her and her snakes to find me. I took action. Grabbing a pitchfork from a nearby rack, I ran toward her. She turned around and hissed a scream of fury. Her face screwed into an unrecognizable fit of rage. I closed my eyes to avoid her gaze. She dodged my lunge and shouted at me as the pitchfork instead shattered the tank behind her. The terrarium broken, snakes began pouring everywhere. I held my eyes shut and had to rely on my other senses.
My babies!
Her voice was seemingly incapable of breaking past a certain volume, almost like that of a smoker. I smelled the poison on her breath, too, like a toxic odor of chemical soups. She grabbed the pitchfork with a strength I could not have fathomed. I began to panic. I risked a glance, avoiding her face. Her taut, ropey arm muscles slackened, as did my own. Snakes continued to pour out from the broken tank. They covered the floor now, slithering amongst my feet and wrapping themselves up around my ankles. I wasn't normally afraid of snakes, but there was no doubt in my mind these were the venomous variety, and she had some paranormal control over them.
My baby's toxin. Stop your heart in seconds. Look at me in the eyes, you fool! Where do you think you are? What do you think you're doing?
Her inflection suggested she recognized me. The snakes were pinning me to the ground, and I clamped my eyes shut again, wrenching the pitchfork from her hands and jabbing it once more in her direction. She was no longer where I expected her to be, so I turned instead to the captors writhing about my legs. I plunged my weapon into the bodies of the snakes below me. I squinted in case she should rally in return, stabbing and scooping the slimy monsters up over my shoulder.
No, please not my baby!
Her voice gave way her position. Knowing I might only have one shot at any of this, I rounded up and thrust once more into her gut with all the force I could muster, lifting her awkward, snakish body up off the ground. I finally risked to open my eyes fully once more to see her gasping and choking on her own green blood, letting the pitchfork and her body drop onto the tank next to us. I stayed to watch a dozen snakes begin coiling in and around her lifeless body. Stepping carefully over the bodies of the snakes, both living and dead, I opened the same door her cohorts had entered minutes earlier. With one last glance towards the slithering chaos of the sun parlor, I found myself in a large kitchen. Pots and pans hung from the ceiling over an island in the center of the room. Turning to the refrigerator, I saw a few drawings in purple crayon. The art was imperfect, rudimentary, but for a child, astonishingly creative. I tried to make out what I was looking at. Most of it was unclear, but for one large man with a meat cleaver and a smile on his face. A tiny dagger ricocheted off the door of the fridge, nearly catching me in the air. I swung about to a commotion behind me, and the sight of the three imps, one hanging from the rack of pots and pans, one standing on the island in the center of the kitchen, and the final one dashing towards my legs. All of them, teeth bared and vicious. I swung my foot at the one darting toward my lower half. I made solid contact, sending him halfway across the kitchen, careening into the dishwasher door. The other two immediately followed suit, from the rack above me, jumping up on my shoulders and neck, clenching on with jagged claws. The other one upon the counter began to pull tiny daggers from his vest and threw them with startling accuracy. One hit me in the forearm as I wrestled with his cohort. Acknowledging this as the more immediate danger, I waited for him to take aim once more and used his impish companion as a shield. Two more daggers found their marks in the imp's back instead of my chest. The tiny monster went limp and dropped to the floor. I saw murderous rage in the beady black eyes of its kin, and the other one on the floor began to right itself, the same anger in its contorted face. They both started toward me, but I didn't allow it. With a roar, I moved forward, grabbing them both by their necks and the scruff of their hairy, grizzled bodies. I dragged them to the pantry on the other side of the room while they kicked and bit me. Throwing them both in, I slammed the door, throwing my back against it. I felt them batter into it, one at a time. I tried to think of my next move. I jammed the door with a chair and moved to the kitchen sink. They rapped away upon the door of the pantry as I saw what I was looking for. Grabbing a large bottle of both bleach and ammonia, I hastily unscrewed both bottles. Holding my breath, I poured both into a pitcher on the counter. Kicking the chair out of the way, I lobbed it into the pantry, leaned against the door again until the pounding slowed and eventually stopped. There was one more door in the room. The final two creatures must have left through it. Leaning my ear against it, I could hear the bellowing voices of the demons in the next room. Not knowing the layout of the house, I wasn't confident what room was on the other side, but the voices I heard did not sound friendly.
We will feed when the time is right.
Now, eat now.
The voices were coming towards me. I had to act fast. I shoved the door open to the wide-eyed glares of two demons standing facing me. We now stood in the great hall I'd entered through the night before. With the fiery light of the morning, the room didn't seem any less foreboding. They spoke once more in their bellowing voices.
Who are you?
Where the rest?
I didn't even consider answering their questions. I saw a fireplace and slowly inched my way toward it as they stared at me. It seemed like their predatory nature would have sent them charging toward me at a moment's notice. I reached slowly above the fireplace for a long sword with a golden hilt that was mounted there. Grasping the sword, I felt a surge of virtue and righteousness. This is when they chose to charge. I swung the sword at the large beastly body careening towards me. It glanced off the foul creature's beastly hide. It rounded up and threw multiple clawed punches at me. One caught me on the shoulder. One narrowly missed my nose. I swung the sword at the demon's face, and once again it barely made a scratch. It may have bruised him more than cut him. Certainly this was not the best tool for the job, but I persisted. Swinging again, the beast caught the blade with one mighty hand. It was then that the other demon had turned back toward me. He was gaining speed and reached for something on his belt. I wrenched the blade from his grasp and shoved the tip into his round, hairy gut. It barely gave, but I kept pushing until the leathery hide caved. The demon's eyes were flaming red and bloodshot as the life left him. Suddenly, with a demonic moan of rage, the second one breathed a stream of unholy fire in my direction. I ducked out of the way, feeling the heat on my back as I did so. I swung the sword at his legs time and time again, hacking like at the bark of a tree. It growled and tried to kick at me. Standing straight, I swung once more into his neck, and it threw him off balance. As he toppled, I pushed him over onto his back and drove the sword into his chest like a shovel. It took all my strength to get the point through the leathery surface of his chest. The sword wobbled and then remained there, upright, after I let it go, and I fell to my knees, surveying the room for any remaining threats, but there were none. I'd done it. I was victorious. Something compelled me to take my journey upstairs. I decided to bring the sword with me, and stepping on his torso, unsheathed it from its demon's corpse. A plume of red flame came from the wound as I did so. I made my way to the stairs, to where I assumed the master of the house would slumber. Peering up the dimly lit stairwell, I saw a door at the top with light leaking through the cracks. I climbed, dragging the sword along, and hit each stair with a clunk. My body ached. With every step, I felt that all too familiar dread. I reached the double doors at the top of the stairs, and I took a deep breath. There was a rustling sound coming from within, what sounded like the scraping of wings against a cage. I turned the knob, swinging the door open. The room was dark, with the light of the morning peeking through the edges of the thick curtains. Slowly, I stepped through the door, allowing my eyes to adjust. I saw an enormous four-posted bed, and toward the far end of the room, a desk, and on it, a fax machine. The room was so quiet. The sound of soft breathing behind the walls. Stepping slowly and softly, halfway through the room, I dropped the sword. Lighting the lamp on the nightstand, I approached the fax machine. I picked up the pages that had not yet been sent. I read through the words, and they made no sense. I read them softly aloud, trying to understand. To my son, Samuel Watts Jr., I grant the entirety of my estate. I fear I don't have much longer for this world. With the sudden and unfortunate passing of my wife, I know that he will be best suited to carry on the legacy we've established here at the Mynde estate. The door to the room closed behind me.
I didn't believe you'd come. I didn't want to believe it.
You! Who are you?
You know exactly who I am. Do you know I tried to get your father to bring you here before? He told me you refused. You don't even know what you've done, do you? What have you done?
She looked down at the bloody sword on the floor. Those monsters, they would have killed me first.
No, you foolish boy, you're mistaken. You're sick. You need help. You will end up just like your father. Please, let me help you.
No, you killed my father. You killed my mother. You killed everyone I ever loved. Her eyes were glossy and conveyed some emotion of which I could not be certain. I looked to the sword I dropped on the floor, and then back at her.
Hush now. Come to me. We can work through this.
I kneeled and picked up the sword, and with one overhead stroke made contact. She'd raised her bare hands and caught the blade with ease. Seeing her power, I lost every bit of my righteous courage I'd had. My strength faded. She pulled, freeing the weapon from my grasp and casting it aside. She reached the same hands out to me. Shaking her head, she looked as if she pitied me. I moved toward her, my own arms outstretched to match hers.
You've just been embarking on a journey through the mind of Samuel Watts. Thank you for listening to Mynde Estate. Please like us on Facebook and Twitter at Mynde Estate. Be sure to tune in next week for the thrilling conclusion to our tale in Chapter 5, The Beyond.
Tri-Paced Pod presents
an awkward audio adaptation of Mynde Estate by Kaleb Nelson. Chapter 5, The Beyond.
As I began to choke the life out of this woman, her gasping cries beckoned a distant memory that echoed through my consciousness. A memory I'd buried deep, the death rattle of my own mother. The bedroom swirled away from my vision as I looked into her eyes, and then down at my own hands, and I just couldn't bring myself to stop. Kicking, flailing wildly, she groped at my fingers, trying to pry them free from her windpipe. Her legs made contact with the nightstand next to the four-post bed, upending it. As her eyelids began to droop, I noticed her arms and legs slow, and eventually go limp and fall to her side. But her fingers curled around an antique brass alarm clock that had fallen to the ground. She bludgeoned me over the head with it. After the first hit, my grip slackened, the pain split through my skull, and still I clung. But after the second, and the third hit, I was seeing stars. By the fourth, I was forced to let go of her entirely. She was now gulping huge lungfuls of air. Standing, she threw the makeshift weapon at me and stumbled toward the door. The clock merely glanced off my shoulder and clattered to the floor.
You stay away from me. Get Get away from me!
She ran out of the room and down the stairs, and I made chase. As I passed the threshold of the room into the hall, I skidded to a halt as the world slipped out from underneath me, and everything went black. I tumbled off into an unknown eternity stretching out beyond my field of vision. My entire body was hurtling through a blackened abyss, heaving in a perilous freefall that would, God willing, defy death. My body careened through the vacuum of darkness, flipping more and more rapidly end over end. I knew the bottom must be approaching soon. I tried to catch my breath in this empty space. Finally, with a deafening thud in my ears, I landed. Face first upon the floor of the hallway, head bursting in sublimation, pain, and that incessant ringing flitted back through my mind as I hoisted myself up, ramping to a labored sprint after that infernal woman. Still, I wobbled slightly, but the gravity seemed to have returned to normal. I had lost sight of her, but I heard a commotion from downstairs. So I followed and burst into the great hall once more. There was silence in the room, except for soft sobbing. She had sank down next to the crudely eviscerated corpses of the fire breathers. Without looking up, she spoke.
No. No. Why? Why?
She lifted her head up. Her face was twisted in anguish and despair. A despair that told me everything I needed to know. These demonic fledglings were her kin. Her sons, her spawn. She looked at me with rage and then fear. She stood, terror on her face as I stepped forward, and she made to run, slipping slightly, smearing the blood and viscera that pooled beneath them. Regaining her balance, she continued through the door to the kitchen. Even I couldn't help but stare at the bodies that seemed to have changed since last I left them. Their hides appeared to be more flesh-like, their demonic faces now almost human. But I carried on following her, driven by an unknown urge to cleanse this home of the wreath of shadows that tainted it. I entered the kitchen and immediately held my sleeve to my nose and mouth. I could tell the chemicals were still lingering in the air, and I saw one of the imps attempt to crawl out of the pantry where I had left him. It. The look of horror on the thing's face seemed so unfamiliar, when all I saw before was evil. I felt my eyes begin to water, so hurrying to avoid a similar fate, I continued out into the still open door to the sun parlor. The room was eerily quiet in the light of the day. The reptiles continued to slither about, and the Gorgon woman was still in the tank I'd left her in. I scanned the room. She couldn't have escaped. I didn't hear the pane glass door close. She must have been hiding. Then, I heard a soft voice from somewhere in the room.
How could you do this to me? You've taken everyone from me. You've murdered my entire family.
You gave birth to this twisted freak too? Did my father even know he was in the presence of mutants and monsters? Or did you trick him? He must have known. He must have tried to escape your enchantments, your curses. I spoke merely to the stagnant air. I was unable to ascertain where her voice was coming from.
I pity you, and how far gone your mind is. This isn't just my child. She's your father's daughter. You've killed your own sister, your own blood.
I paused, finally gazing into the lifeless eyes of the Gorgon. I saw she wasn't lying. They were my eyes, my father's eyes. She wanted me to believe this was my half-sister. This thing wasn't even half-human. Must have been more of her rotten trickery.
She was good. and you stole it from me. Why are you doing this? What madness drives you?
So she hadn't been hiding, just seated, ashen and defeated behind the tank where her freakish spawn had been vanquished. She stood straight and tall, and I stared into the depths of her blackened heart. I don't need your pity, succubus. I need you to die. Perhaps the only fleeting moments of clarity my father knew as I do. I will succeed where he failed. You are going back to that abyssal hell you came from.
Maybe you will, and then I'll be gone. But you will live forever in a tormented hell of your own making. You need help. Please, let me help you.
I won't succumb so easily to your spell. You're finished. You're already dead. I stepped toward her, and her skin turned jet black, her eyes wild and yellow, her hair weightless, unbeholden to gravity. She slipped from my grasp and slinked out of the pane glass door into the courtyard, screeching terribly as she did so. I gave chase once more, my body now ignoring any pain or exhaustion it felt. Exiting the manor into the light of day, I was empowered by righteousness. Holy conviction filled my muscles and pumped through my veins. The sun blared white hot, and it seemed God was finally on my side as I continued my just crusade. All I saw was pure white, elated and high as if I were among the clouds. Following in the footsteps of all the virtuous heroes and saints that came before me, I would smite this woman, this embodiment of death herself. She would perish by my hand. But as if equal and opposite, fear of reckoning and the devil's malevolence appeared to urge her on just out of my grasp. And so we ran, along the tree line to her unavoidable doom, and toward my own inevitable salvation. She had stopped at my father's grave. I stopped too, watching her. As if saying goodbye, she knelt and caressed the side of his tombstone, bowing her head and whispering inaudibly. I grabbed the shovel that had obviously been used to dig the grave. Walking to her, I looked down at her, and she looked up at me, blackened, horrid tears streaming from her eyes.
We'll be waiting for you, my son. On the other side.
I tried to ignore her venomous words as I pushed her down into the hole with the force of my heel. I began to fill the grave of my father as the muffled sounds of her pleas for mercy were silenced by the soil.
This is it, right? What do you think, Sheriff? Shall we just go ahead and knock?
Might as well. Seems futile, though. Doesn't appear anyone is home. This is usually such a lively place. I'm telling you, Jorgensen, I think this lot must have cleared out.
Ah, Mr. Jorgensen. Come in, come in.
Sam, good to see you. My, you're looking chipper today.
Well, it's a fine day, is it not? I looked over to the sheriff that accompanied Mr. Jorgensen. He had a mustache and a hat with a star on it. I couldn't have imagined a man more befitting of the title small-town sheriff. I scrunched my face up into something resembling concern.
Sam, this is Sheriff Ralston. He's been kind enough to escort me here. Apparently there's been some unusual activity around here lately.
Unusual activity? Of what sort? The sheriff looked at me with a marked amount of suspicion, and I continued to stare right back at him.
Well, Mr. Watts, was it? 2 days ago, we found a woman's body in a bathtub of a nearby hotel. You wouldn't by any chance know anything about that, would you?
Maybe we don't need it.
I couldn't hide the shock and dismay on my face. Not a thing, Sheriff. That's absolutely horrible. I came straight here from the train station yesterday. I haven't yet ventured into town.
And there was no one here when you arrived?
Not a soul. I was just giving myself a tour of the place, and it truly is breathtaking. I found the rest of that will, by the way, Mr. Jorgensen. I do believe the news couldn't be better. I handed the lawyer the 2 remaining pages of my father's will, his signature scrawled in ink at the bottom. After a few moments, the lawyer's eyes lit up as well.
Well, congratulations, Sam. This is everything we needed. Let me just make a few calls and we'll begin the process.
He pulled out his cell phone and tried to find service. The sheriff took a glance at the will as well. His eyes narrowed, and he looked back up at me.
It says here the lady of the house has also passed.
Yes, I suppose she has. I believe I noticed her grave buried in the back with my father. I never met her, but I'm glad they're resting peacefully together now.
Unfortunate. And unusual. This is the first time hearing of her passing.
They were an odd folk. As you can plainly see, her and my father had an eclectic taste. He's changed a lot since he left my mother. Quite an unusual collection of oddities here.
Indeed. They held a carnival here during the summers. I did hear they were taking the summer off, in lieu of the mourning of your father. Here, take a look at this.
He handed me a pamphlet and I unfolded it. Circus de Mine and Spectacle Extraordinaire, it read. Taste our sommelier's finest sweet wines, fresh veal, and exotic meat cuts from our own in-house butcher, and a variety of performance sideshows. This list was quite lengthy. Snake charming, fire breathing, hook suspension artists, acrobatics, knife throwing, and show hyenas. There was also a group photo on the back. My father, smiling and happy with his arms around the woman he had left my mother for, surrounded by the rest of the circus troupe.
I guess the troupe left town upon the passing of the lady of the house and your father. You can keep that. Do me a favor, though. Please let me know if anyone in that picture contacts you. Here's my card.
Thank you, Sheriff. I will, absolutely. Jorgensen returned to the room positively beaming. He must have realized I'd be paying him handsomely for any fees associated with his service.
Sam, my boy, let me be the first to welcome you to your new home. Of course, there will be some additional paperwork for you to sign at my office, but I can't imagine that'll put a damper on your mood today. I mean, with all due respect to your family.
He switched quickly back to the faux, apologetic, almost laughable attempt at a somber expression. Well, every dark cloud has a silver lining, and it does appear God has smiled upon me today.
It does appear that way.
It was pretty clear that the sheriff wasn't quite ready to trust me, but I was pretty confident things would work out in the end. Sheriff, if it's not too much trouble, would you mind coming by later in the week and helping me work out where the boundaries of the estate lie? Perhaps I'm just paranoid, but this place is a little bit spooky at night.
Shouldn't be a problem. I'll have my deputy call you and schedule a visit. And this is normally a very safe part of town. I'm sure the danger is just in your head.
Oh, I'm sure. But even still, it would be appreciated. I escorted the 2 men out to the main gate. All of this, mine. It's hard to believe if not for the trials I went through to attain it. I took another look at the picture on the back of the pamphlet the sheriff had given to me. My father's smile resembled my own. Underneath the picture read one final exclamation. See it all at the Mynde estate.
You've just been embarking on a journey through the mind of Samuel Watts. Thank you for listening to Mynde Estate. Please like us on Facebook at Mynde Estate.
One day I know, don't leave this all
you.